Hi everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit about reading strategies in our course text to just kind of kick us off. We've done a little bit of reading, but now we're really getting into the literature aspect of this course. And so first, let's talk a little bit about reading strategies. This is kind of an interesting time due to the pandemic and the quarantine and not being on campus. And maybe not being in a place where it's easy to just sit and read quietly. So with that in mind, I want to make sure that you're really putting some thought and effort into finding a space. This doesn't mean that you have to go out of your home or wherever you're staying. It doesn't mean that you have to have the most comfortable chair or anything like that. It just means that you need to find a place where you can be productive. Across the years, I've noticed that I need different spaces. So when I was in grad school, the place where I could be the most productive, both with my reading and writing, was Starbucks. It got kind of expensive, so that's something to think about. And especially if you're at a place where you're not comfortable going out in public, right, that this may just not be an option. But I also needed to recognize about myself that I got less and less productive because I started watching people more and more. So you need to really recognize what you are doing as a reader, right? If you need to change your space, if you need to change your approach. Some of you probably like to listen to music, right? Whether that's in earbuds or if you're in a space where you can just play the music freely. Please start to kind of recognize when you're losing focus. It may be because of the music that you're choosing. If you're like me, I need something in the background, but I need it to be something I can ignore. I like, to listen to classical music or instrumental music. I really like Trombone Shorty if y'all are into jazz, because I can listen to it and appreciate it, but it's not taking all of my attention. I can still focus on the reading that's in front of me. For a while, I was listening to music I really liked, but I began to not pay attention at all to what I was reading, right? So just kind of understand that about yourself. Some of you need very quiet spaces. If you're not able to find that, then maybe consider downloading a white noise app or something on your phone where it is noise, but it can kind of block out voices or the sounds of kids running around or dogs barking or whatever's going on in your space that might be a little bit distracting. Okay, so those are some just kind of basics when it comes to reading strategies. Now I want to specifically talk about our book. Some of you have the physical copy in front of you. Some of you are using the electronic version. You need to in some way make sure that you're engaging with the text. What I mean by this is that you are not just, if you have the physical version, just kind of flipping through the pages and just not really focusing and paying attention to what is kind of going by on each page. If you are using the electronic version, you're not just kind of scrolling, or if you're on a tablet, whatever, you're not just going and just not paying attention and actively engaging in what you're reading. The best way to avoid that is to focus on taking notes in some way. I really, in my face-to-face classes, my students are required to keep a reading notebook, and that makes absolutely certain that things are, you're not just flipping the pages mindlessly. Okay, you are taking notes of important information. Now, in our class, we don't need specific dates and locations. We don't need that kind of information. We just need to make sure that we're keeping track of who the author is, what the person is talking about and writing about, any interesting facts or quotes that come. A lot of times students are writing notes in the margins of their book. But if you can't do that because you're renting a text or it's an online version, find other creative ways to keep notes. Whether it is taking a stack of Post-its and putting that in your book if you're just renting it, or if it is just taking traditional kinds of notes in a notebook or even on Post-its, something. When you are doing that kind of engaged and active reading, please make sure you're keeping track of page numbers. This is going to be extremely helpful down the line when we start, thinking about our paper topic posts and doing those like weekly journals. It's easier to have those page numbers handy versus having to flip through pages in the physical book or scroll through to try to find something that you found really exciting, interesting, enjoyable. There will be times when I ask you to provide quotes, right? You want to be able to support your ideas. That's any part of literature studies and literary criticism. We are literary critics, right? So keep track of that information. Um, Along the same line, please make sure that you are understanding how long it takes you to get through the reading. Even something that is like, oh, I can knock out 10 pages in our text really quickly. You're probably coming to find out that 10 pages in our course text can take some time. The print is painfully small on some pages, so it takes a while. And some of the ideas are not just easy to digest and work through. You have to take some time to grapple with them. So I really suggest that you break apart the readings. Don't just sit and in one go try to do the reading for the writing journal and the reading response. Break those apart. But again, you know yourself. So find the time of day that's going to work best for you. Some of you are going to really be able to pay attention more in the morning. Some of you are night owls. So just keep some of these things in mind so that you are really, you're not having to double your work. You're not reading and not really kind of paying attention to stuff and then having to go back and reread in order to answer some of the discussion posts. Okay, so don't put more work on yourself. The other thing I want to talk about is just the text in general. And that is, we need to keep in mind that behind this huge collection of different works, there are editors, right? There are editors that are working to put this information together for us. And so they are the ones that wrote the introduction that we read for last week. They're writing all the biographical information for the authors or some of the background information for the different time periods we'll go through. We want to make sure that we are reading that information as it's assigned, but also separating the authors for that information from the authors from the different time periods, right? So when we read the texts by the Native American authors for this week, we get some of the background and biographical information that's written by our editors, and that is separate from the text written or spoken by these Native American authors, right, or speakers. Don't be confused by the way that that's structured in the book, right? And we want to give credit to either the editors or the original speakers or authors, okay? I'm going to keep hitting on this again and again because there are some places in the book where it's kind of confusing, but most of the people we're reading didn't write their own biographies, right? So those are coming from a different source. The last thing I want to hit on before we kind of I move into the weekly assignments in a separate video is I want you to really make sure that you're paying attention to your own position as a reader. It's really important that as we're reading these different texts from these different authors and time periods, that we're understanding our own identity and how our identity plays a part in how we're reading something, right? So we're bringing all of our different experiences and all the different aspects of who we are to the way we're reading and the way that we're responding to the different reading, right? So we need to really make sure that we're keying into that, but also addressing that. Right? Right now, and especially with what's going on in society with protests addressing police brutality, police murder, we need to make sure that we're keeping an eye on these kinds of texts. This time period has led to what we're going through socially right now, right? What's happening in society. So it's important that I'll use myself as an example. I am an older-ish white woman with experiences that a white woman has, right? So I am reading these texts without having the understanding of what it means to be a person of color in any time period, right? And I certainly don't have the experience of being a person living during this time, right? So we have to understand that we have these modern understandings of society and law and the development of our country, but we still are reading through particular lenses. I am a woman, I'm not reading as a man, right? We have to kind of take these things into consideration and make sure that we're not being biased by anything, right? Again, now is a time when we are having a reckoning with our past. And I think we are lucky to be in a course like this that is examining some of the beginnings of these issues in our country, right? There is a reason we are having protests right now. There's a reason that we had the American Indian movement in the 70s. There are reasons we had the feminist movement. There are reasons we had the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. These are all results of a long history, and we're reading some of the origins of that, Okay, and I also want to remind you, and I've said this before, our class is really looking to focus on some of the voices that have been neglected or ignored historically. So we're reading information about and by Native Americans, right? And so we should really understand that many of our experiences, we have histories of immigration in our own families, right? But those have often been ignored or put aside. So again, I am coming from a long history of people residing in the US, but I don't have Native American ancestry that I'm aware of, so I cannot read these Native American authors with that kind of experience or understanding. So I have to be aware of that, right? Um, I also want us to consider that because we're reading some of the authors that have been neglected throughout history, it means that we're not going to be able to read absolutely everybody in this text, okay? A lot of times in classes like this, we read texts by authors whose names we might recognize, right? And we're reading a few. We're reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. We're reading Thomas Jefferson. But we're also going to be able to critique those authors, right? There's a reason we know their names and we don't know other people's names. Those people have been either deliberately or unintentionally ignored throughout history, and we're working to fill in some of those gaps. That work is really important right now. I can't stress that enough. So be prepared for me to hate on Thomas Jefferson a bit in upcoming weeks when we read him. And if that's not the kind of class that you're interested in taking, then, I would urge you to stay in and really kind of work to address why that might be. But if this isn't the class for you, then I completely, respect that you might want to choose something else. We're still at the start of this summer session, so you can go to another course where your needs might be met more. But again, this class, especially now, has become very important in my mind, and I hope you see that as well. Especially because some of you mentioned that you wanted to learn more about the Civil War. We're not going to learn specifically about the Civil War, but the things that we are reading in this class lead up to the Civil War and address this notion of, when people say that the Civil War was fought due to states' rights. I mean, on a very basic level, we could argue that, but it was states' rights to own slaves, right? So we're reading the development of that, especially when we get into next week. We're looking at some different authors that have experiences being enslaved, right? And writing from those experiences. So again, important work that we're doing. I also want you to note that we are reading a book that was put together by particular people. So just because it's in this text doesn't mean it's the be-all, end-all in early American literature. There's only so much you can include in one book, and there are also politics and English studies that mean that some people didn't end up in this book, right? So if you become very interested in a particular time period and era within our book, explore, see who else is out there. You're welcome to email me or to ask questions in the Q&A area if you want to kind of expand your reading and move in different directions. It's a lot of information I've covered today, and I hope that you take it for what it's intended in terms of just offering some assistance and helping you through this class, and to make sure that we're paying attention to those things that are really important. All right, I'm going to post a separate video for the weekly assignment, but I just wanted to give you some tips, tricks, strategies to get us through our reading, but also to really push us to think about some of the things that will affect our reading in the future. All right, hang in there.